Well, this morning I want to talk about being a Christian that knows who they belong to. I want to talk about being an influential Christian this morning. We're going to be looking in the book of Acts, starting out in chapter 27, verses 20 through 26. And this morning I want to talk about in every circumstance and every situation, being one of those individuals who is able to show God's light and God's amazing mercies in our everyday lives and the way we live and the way we act. And this morning we're going to do that by looking at the life of Paul and some of the ways that he did it. I'm going to start out reading in verse 20 of Acts chapter 27. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. So here we are in the middle of a storm that has gone on for days. Some of you know what that feels like. Maybe not at sea, but you've been in a storm before. You've been in a place where you didn't see an end in sight to your circumstance or your situation. This morning, I want to look at being someone who, whether in the storm or not, can change the mood and the outcome by remaining strong in their faith. In this case, it's Paul. And I can tell you now that these men that are in the boat with him, they better be grateful that there's a Paul in the boat. You know, one of the things Amy always loves to say, and I like the idea of it, is Amy says you can either be a thermostat or a thermometer. See, and the difference is a thermometer can only reflect what's going on in the room, but a thermostat can change it. This morning, I believe that as a church, we should be individuals that change the rooms we enter in. And when we're in a boat, when we're in a storm, when we're in a situation, I hope that we can be more like Paul and one that reflects Christ and changes the very outcome of those around us just by serving Him. Verse 21, it says, after they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves the damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me. I want to stop right there for a second, because I love the way that sounds. An angel of the God to whom I belong. See, some of us forget who we belong to. I've caught myself on many occasions acting like a spiritual orphan, not realizing that I serve a heavenly Father who is incredible. Of the God to whom I belong. I want to try saying that together as a church this morning. I want to try saying that, of the God to whom I belong. Would you say it with me? Of the God to whom I belong. One more time. Of the God to whom I belong. Do you believe that this morning, church? This morning we didn't have prayer during our normal worship time. We're gonna have an altar time at the end of service, but before we get there, I want you to understand that point. The God to whom I belong. Verse 23 continues. It says, last night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who you sail with. Did you catch that? God said you can't die yet because there's still a bigger fight for you to fight later on. You know, God takes the time to point out that this isn't it for you, Paul. I have something more for you. And oh, by the way, I'm going to give you the lives of all those in the boat with you. Can I tell you this morning, they better be grateful that there was a Paul in the boat. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as He told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. Be glad Paul was on board. Father, this morning I pray that we would be the church in our homes, our work, at our grocery stores, wherever you would lead us, that we would have the wherewithal to be present in the moment and to be your vessels in everyday life. God, allow us to be influential Christians in every moment of every day. God, may your word this morning be heard and impact our hearts as you would see fit, God. God, we thank you for the opportunities that you're going to place before us in Jesus' name. Amen. You know, I like that even Paul, being the spiritual giant that he is not too big to point out, I told you so. Because if you read that, Paul takes time to point out, I told you so. He's in the middle of a storm where people are starving and don't believe there's any hope left. And the first thing he does is say, I told you so. If you would have listened to me and not sailed from Crete, like I said, we could have avoided this damage and this loss. And here Paul is pointing it out and warning the sailor that he warned the sailors trying to get to Italy. Paul was there trying to spread the gospel, and he was taken on this boat not because of some mistake he made or some bad decision, but Paul was placed on this boat for doing what he was supposed to be doing. I think that's important because Paul in this situation, a lot of times we make a bad decision and it puts us in a storm. Paul is in the storm for doing what God called him to do. Paul finds himself in the middle of the storm, in the middle of this hard time for doing exactly what God wanted. I love we see Paul here on the boat, and he doesn't really belong. He's taken prisoner for doing the right thing, for doing what God wanted. Hear me for a second. In this storm, for doing what God wanted him to do, being accused of things that he hasn't done. And as he speaks, he points it out that it didn't have to happen. But also, he takes the opportunity to show his faith in the middle of a storm. That he had every right to be upset. He had every right to be mad. He had every right to be mad at these people for sure. But he had a right probably to be mad at God. How many of you guys have ever been there? You feel like, God, I'm doing everything I'm supposed to do. So why am I in this? But Paul doesn't do that. He doesn't dwell in the why. Because he realizes there's a purpose. I want you to think about it. I'm doing what God called me to do, and in the middle of it all, I'm being mistreated and pushed around in a storm. I'm hungry. And I'll be honest, that's the one that gets me. I don't do hungry. I enjoy food entirely too much. I like food. But there may have been some frustration with Paul saying that I told you so. But he doesn't take time to make excuses. He doesn't wallow in self-pity. He takes the moment to believe and to show his faith. See, this is important not just in this story, but so many of Paul's stories. Paul is in a place where he doesn't belong for doing what was right. He writes a large part of the Bible sitting in prison. He's persecuted, he's stoned, he's shipwrecked. I believe, and I may be wrong, I think he's shipwrecked 4 times. 3 times in his writing and then here in Acts. He was shipwrecked 4. I don't know to tell you, if I get shipwrecked, I might be done. I don't know. Paul had a lot of reason to give up, to dwell in self-pity, to let all these things derail his mission for spreading the gospel, and no one would have blamed him. Any one of those things, being put in prison, persecuted, stoned, shipwrecked, any one of those things, we would have understood if Paul said, I'm done. But Paul gets past it, past the why this is happening, and he focuses on the opportunity that God is putting in front of him. Paul was willing to just go forward. As Christians, we sometimes focus so much on the reason that we are where we are that we fail to be there for one another. We fail to recognize the opportunity to wait upon God, to trust in God for his provision, for his plan. You know, we like to give people hope in those moments. There's so many scriptures that we point to. Jeremiah 29:11, for I know the plans I have for you. Romans 8:28 says, and we know in all things God works for the good of those that love him. We feel like we need to explain every moment and every situation, every circumstance. And sometimes we need those scriptures to reassure us. But sometimes we just need to be there for one another. It's not about the why. It's not about how come we're here. Sometimes we just need to be present in the moment. You know, when Job lost everything and his friends come and they mourn with him. You know, when you see that story, they come and for days they mourn and they weep with him. There's not a lot of talking. They're not trying to explain it away. They're not trying to figure it out. They just mourn with him. In fact, later when they start talking, I think is when they miss it. Just being there with him. We see throughout the Bible and in our everyday lives where people say or believe that there must be something going on for you to be in this situation. Sometimes things just go wrong. Even when we're doing right, sometimes life just hurts. We live in a broken world with broken people. Sometimes situations that we get put there because God is trying to take us to somewhere or put us through something so we can learn something. Sometimes we just make a bad decision and get ourselves there. Sometimes we're put there by others' bad decisions. Whatever the reason that you were in the storm you're in, I think the why is less important than to the God whom I belong. This morning, I want you to know that you're never alone. God is with you. And I hope that we are the church that is going to stand with you too. I hope there's a Paul in your boat. Paul tells me, he said, this didn't have to happen. It was avoidable. But yet it was inevitable. I wonder if Jesus, when he was facing persecution from the religious leaders and everybody, Jesus came with a mission and a plan, and he knew what was going to happen to him. But I wonder if Jesus ever reached the point where he looked at the religious leaders who, for all intentional purposes, their very being was to see the coming of the Messiah. That was their hope, that was their dream, that was everything they wanted. That's what they lived for, was to see the Messiah come. These were the religious leaders, and yet here they are persecuting the very one that has come for them. And I don't know if it was that they were blinded by their greed and their circumstances. I don't know if it was blinded, that their pride just couldn't get past that it wasn't happening the way they wanted it to happen. And I can't help but to wonder if Jesus looked at them and just thought, you people, it doesn't have to happen this way. I'm right here in front of you. But Jesus doesn't get caught up in the why. He doesn't get stuck in the very ones that should support him or persecute him. He doesn't get stuck in all of that. Because the here is less important than the plan of his Father. Paul was focused on the plan of his Father, and because he was able to get past the why and focus on the believe. I believe it will happen as he said. We need to focus on the plan in front of us and stop worrying so much about why we're in the place. I believe that we should learn from our mistakes, yes, but don't let it derail the plan for your life. If we're to be influential Christians, we must be able to move forward without starting over. Here's the simple truth, that whether you believe this is God or the devil, it has to pass through the same hands to get to you. If it was a bad decision that put you where you are, yours or someone else's, God can in every way get you to where he wants you to be. I don't believe for a second that God was making a plan for your life and someone came along and made a dumb decision and ruined your day, and God goes, ugh, there goes my plan. They ruined it. I can tell you now that God knows what's going to happen. He knows where you're at. The only person that can derail your plan for your life is you. We have to stop worrying about why we are in the situation we're in, and remember, there is still work to be done. This isn't the final place for me. See, if you get stuck in the storm and forget to grow through it, you might miss the miracle that God is preparing. Paul in the storm is able to give hope to everyone on board. Be glad Paul was on board. Can I say that in this church, I believe we have some Paul-esque individuals on board? We have some people in this church that they believe that they live serving a God who is incredible. You can see it in the way they speak. You can see it in the way they walk and talk and act and live. I'm thankful for the Pauls, for those that believe that what he says is going to happen just as he said it would. We have some Paul-like individuals in this church. People who are living the story they believe God has for them. They believe that God is still in charge and that they want to see it through no matter how bad the storm looks at the moment. This morning, I hope we're grateful that there are Pauls on board. Paul here in the middle of the storm is able to stand up and say, there's a reason we are here. It could have been avoided, but last night an angel of the God whom I belong reminded me that he wasn't finished with me yet. And his plan is still in place. This isn't the end for me. And by the way, you're all saved too. God in this moment gives Paul a direction. He doesn't give him a reason or excuse. He gives him a future. Sometimes we get so caught up in the reason we had to go through the storm or the reason why we're hurting that we can't hear the direction God is giving us. I think too many times I've missed the opportunity that God had for me because I couldn't get past the why. God just tells Paul, you can't be done here because I still have plans for you. I was listening to a debate a while back between a Christian and an atheist, and the atheist was trying to derail the idea of God, and he asked the Christian, if God created all of this, the heaven and the earth and everything else, well, where did God come from? Who created God? At what time did he come into existence? And the Christian's answer was simple. He said, your question is predicated on the idea that God is limited to time, space, and matter. See, you must have the wrong God because the God of the Bible is not confined to these restraints. And if he was, he wouldn't be God. See, for us, time and space and matter all have to come into existence at the same time because if there were no matter but space, where would you put it? If there were matter and space but no time, when would you put it? See, time, space, and matter need to come into existence simultaneously, and the Bible answers this in 10 words. In the beginning, time. God created the heaven, space, and the earth, matter. So there you have all three. And the God that created them would have to be outside of them. If he were trapped inside them, he would not be God. The person who made this computer is not inside the computer, running around changing the screen. See, the creator would have to be outside of it. You know, sometimes we forget that the God we serve is not limited to the same restraints that we understand. He's not confined by the realities that I have. Last week at youth, we were in small groups, and I brought up how hard it was sometimes to do a job without knowing the reason if I were told to do it. If I showed up to work and my boss said, I want you to move this pile of rocks from here to over there. Okay? If I show up the next day and he said, hey, I want you to take that pile of rocks over there and put it back over here, I'm going to need to know why. That's just the way I'm wired. And in my head, I'm thinking, well, if you'll tell me why, I might be able to figure out a shorter way to get this done. I might be able to fix this. I want to know why. Sometimes we don't need to know why. Sometimes God doesn't give us a why. Jim pointed out to our students towards the end of it, he said, you want to know one of the biggest reasons why? Because as a boss, if I tell you to move this rock from here to there, and then I tell you to move it from there to there, and you can't get that done, if I can't trust you to do simple tasks, how can I trust you with a big task? You know, I believe that so many times God is saying, I need you to do this, and we are like, why? We spend so much time on the reason why that we forget that God has a bigger picture, and he knows what he's doing. And if we could get past the why and just get to the task, he could trust us with a lot bigger tasks. We sometimes forget that the God we serve is outside of the storm that we're in. And if you're anything like me, if you knew the reason why, you might try and fix it yourself. And that wasn't God's purpose. This morning, it's important for us to understand that God is a good God, that he does good, that he is good, that he's never going to leave you. It's important for us to realize that he is who he says he is. When we're in a bad place, we don't need a reason, we need a way. We need a direction. We need the one who is outside of the moment that can see the way through it with clarity. The one who can say, this isn't it for you because I have a bigger battle ahead of you. You might be shipwrecked, but you're going to survive. We don't need a reason, we need him. Paul is able to stand up and say that the boat will be lost, but all you are going to make it. Sometimes we need a Paul to point out that we may suffer loss, but we won't lose the most important thing. And that there's a future beyond this, and that God will be there through it all. I want to skip down to Acts chapter 28, verse 1 as we continue this story. Verse 1, it says, once safely on shore, we found out that the island was called Malta. The islanders showed us unusual kindness. They built a fire and welcomed us all because it was raining and cold. So Paul said, I believe it will be as he says it will be, and here we are on the island of Malta. I want for a second for you to realize how good it must feel in that moment and how absolutely terrible at the same time. Because if you've ever been in a storm like that, I've never been on a ship, especially on one in a storm, but if you've ever been out at sea and you're tired and hungry and out of food and you're pretty sure you're never going to see land again, to be shipwrecked, there's a part of you that is just happy to be on land. But then there's still the wreckage and the uncertainty of being on an abandoned island that you know nothing about. You know, sometimes we come through the storm only to find ourselves shipwrecked somewhere we don't know how to get out of. Some of you are getting a picture of where we are because some of you are there this morning, or some of you have been there in a storm that you couldn't see the end of and not sure how you can have hope. If you're there this morning, I hope you have a Paul in the boat with you. And this morning, we're going to end with altar time, and we're going to stand with you and pray with you. I believe Paul will come alongside you and tell you, it's bad, but we're not done yet. Maybe you've come through the storm, but now you face wreckage and being in a place where you're not sure about, cold and raining, stranded on a foreign island. So Paul, doing good, gets arrested, thrown on a boat. He tells them not to go, and then a storm hits and pushes them around. When food runs out and all hope was lost, God shows up. Paul is shipwrecked and now in a place Paul never meant to go. And is there mostly because others' choices, and shipwrecked after a long, hard storm in a place where he didn't expect to be. Some of you are in a storm where you didn't expect to be, and whether you're by your own decisions or someone else's, you're in a place you never thought you would be. You've gone through a season you never thought you would have to go through. The job you didn't plan to lose, the hardship you didn't know was coming. You know, I think a lot of times we look at situations and say, this kind of thing happens to other people. It doesn't happen to me. In a place you never planned to end up, wherever that is for you. Other people's kids act like that, not mine. That relationship that was never supposed to end up there. No matter how you got there, though, I want to look at Paul and how he handled it and realize that God has a plan and a purpose still for us. Continuing to verse 2, it says, the islanders showed us unusual kindness. They built a fire and welcomed us, all because it was raining and cold. Paul gathered a pile of brushwood, and as he put it on the fire, a viper, driven out by the heat, fastened itself on his hand. So just to recap, Paul was in prison for preaching the gospel. He's thrown on a ship and he's starving and hurting. He's battered around after warning him not to go in the first place. Then he's shipwrecked. And at the point where he thought it might be over, they're in a place where he has every right to sit down and just be pitiful because he has been through all of this. And I want to tell you, if I had been through all this, I'm probably going to be worthless because my pouting does not allow me to do much more. But Paul takes the moment. He says, in this situation, you know what? I'm not going to sit here and pout. He gets up and starts helping to build the fire to warm them. He's still being proactive. And in the middle of this, a snake comes out of the brush, out of the fire, and latches onto his arm. Latches on. It didn't just strike him, it latched on. Really? Really? I mean, seriously, all of this that he's going through. I might have given up. I might have called it quits. Have you ever been there? Every time you turn around, you think, okay, now I can move forward, and then one more thing, and one more thing. So the snake comes out of the fire that Paul is trying to help build on an island Paul never wanted to go to and fastens itself to Paul's hand. Verse 4. It said, when the islanders saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to each other, this man must be a murderer, for though he escaped from the sea, the goddess Justice has not allowed him to live. So Paul, doing the right thing, is persecuted, and now people around him have started to judge him. They start talking. Surely now Paul can give up and go home. Verse 5. Watch this. Paul shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no ill effect. The people expected him to swell up or suddenly fall dead, but after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. From murderer to God. And this is one of the reasons that we have to live according to our Father's plans for us and not people's, because if we're living by people, that's how quick we're going to go up and down. I want you to know something. Paul shook it off, and I believe that when he did it with a confidence, because in chapter 27, verse 24, God told Paul that he had plans for him, and he doesn't need to say it again. Because Paul is living in the direction that God pointed him, not in the why am I here. Because if Paul was living in the why am I here, he would be starting over with God all over again. You know, I wish I could say I'm better about this, but the truth is every time something happens to me, I feel like I start over. And I don't think God intends that. See, God told Paul on the ship, you can't die on this ship because I have a plan for you to stand before Caesar. And then they're shipwrecked, and he knew that was going to happen, but now the snake comes out and bites him. I can tell you now that myself and so many others, when that happens, we say, it's all over again. And God would have to come back to me and say, I told you, you're going to stand before Caesar. This isn't it for you. I don't want to live that way. I want to live like Paul with a confidence and a belief and a knowledge that God has a plan for me and a future for me. And it doesn't end here. I don't know how bad the storm is getting for you. I don't know how bad it's going to get. But I can tell you now that if you can walk like Paul, you can say it hurts, it's bad, but I have a future. And it doesn't end here. I want to come to a place where I can say, this isn't it because the God to whom I belong has already said it isn't. Paul knew that he would be okay even after a viper bite. The people stood around waiting for Paul to die, and he just shook it back into the fire. You know, more important than for Paul to walk in faith as he shakes the snake loose into the fire? I believe it was even more important for those watching. See, it is so important for us to live in faith, especially in the hard times, especially in the storms, because there are people that watch us. This has more understanding now for me than it ever did, because I have kids, and my kids, they watch everything you do, even when you don't even know they're in the room. But some of us, we work in places where there's very few Paul-like individuals. Some of us don't really have a Paul in our home. Some of us don't really have a Paul in the areas that we go to. There's very few Pauls at our schools. This morning we need some Paul-like people. Because the people that are in the boat with them are going to be able to see someone shake it off. We don't always have a Paul in the boat with us. Someone may need to see you go through the storm with confidence and know that you don't belong to this circumstance. They need to see that you don't belong to this storm, but that you belong to the God to whom I belong. I have a question for you this morning. I want to ask, can you be more than a conqueror in the middle of your storm? Because you have a hope that not everyone has. You live in a promise that some people don't know. What would happen if those that are called by His name would stop living reactionary and start living with a belief that I truly belong to this God whom I belong? What might God do in our workplace, in our home, in our schools, in our church then? Because sometimes it's bigger than just you getting your miracle. Sometimes it's bigger than just you getting through the storm. Sometimes the one watching you needs to see it. In one of our Wednesday night classes, we talked about the fact that most people will not connect with you in your strengths, but they will connect to you in your weaknesses. You know, I don't care who you are. There's something about watching someone go through a hard time or go through a storm that you have empathy for them. It can be someone you don't like. When they're going through a hard time, you have empathy for them People will see you go through a storm, and they'll start to say, oh, I know how that feels. I've been there. I've hurt like that. And people will see that. And when they watch you go into that storm, they'll be thinking, I know what happens next because I've been there. But something happens when they watch you go into that storm and they think, I know what's coming. But it doesn't happen the way they think it's going to happen. Because for you in that storm, you shake the snake loose. And these people that are watching you, these people that see you go into a storm, and they start to see that you have something they don't. They're going to start to see that there's something in your life that they don't have. Because when they went through the storm, they couldn't shake it off. They couldn't break free. They didn't have a hope that there was future because they didn't know that there was a future beyond it. You know, some of us are working in places and living in places and going into places where there are very few Pauls. And that person needs to see you shake it off. Because they're going to begin to say, I don't know what it is, but I need it in my life. I want to see people come through those doors and say, I don't know what you've got, but I want some of it. I need it in my life. I need it in my home. I need it in my marriage. I need it in my workplace. I need it in my parenting. I need some of that, whatever it is. Someone is going to see you go through that storm. And this morning, I wish I could tell you it's all going to be okay. I can't tell you that you won't be arrested or starved or shipwrecked. I can't tell you that the snake is not going to latch onto your hand. But I can tell you that God is with you and He sees the destination that He wants for you, and nothing is going to stop you from getting there as long as you believe that and as long as you trust that you belong to this God to whom I belong. And you just might take a few onlookers with you to that destination. Maybe God will tell you that the ship will be lost, but I'm going to give you all these people that are in the boat with you. They're all going to make it because I have a plan for your life. And you believed in that plan and you were obedient. And as you were obedient, the lives of those in the boat with you were changed. Would the storm be worth it then? Can we live in that place? All because we were on a boat with a Paul. I had a sermon not long ago that shook me to the core, and I've heard it before, but when he preached it, there was something different about it. He said we have to stop acting like we're spiritual orphans. And that bothered me because I grew up in the church. I know who God is. But there are times when I forget that He's outside of the storm. There are times that I forget that I belong to a Father who is so incredible. And He sees through my storm. He sees through my circumstance. To the God whom I belong. Sometimes while we're preparing for a shipwreck, God is going before us and planning a miracle. Though He slay me, yet will I trust Him. Faith may not keep you from being washed up on shore or from being bit. But it will give you hope enough to get up and go forward. It will give you the strength to shake it off. I want to continue in verse 7. It says, there was an estate nearby that belonged to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us to his home and showed us generous hospitality for 3 days. His father was sick in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went in to see him, and after prayer, placed his hand on him, and he healed him. When this had happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured. They honored us in many ways, and when we were ready to sail, they furnished us with the supplies we needed. We see this morning, and Paul didn't plan for Malta. I don't believe it was on his bucket list. I'm pretty sure it wasn't. But now that he's here, he has a decision to make. And so many of us are going to face those moments when we suddenly are faced with a decision of how we are going to respond to the storm that we're facing. How we're going to respond to the circumstance that we've been put in. We could sit and wait it out because we don't belong here and it wasn't our fault. We can sit and pout because we didn't get us here. You know, there's a lot of times, especially when I feel like I'm doing the right thing, that I feel like I'm entitled. And it would be easy to sit and believe that I don't belong here because I was doing the right thing. Or we can be the church in the storm. Amy, would you come? See, the most amazing thing about this story to me is not just what Paul was able to do, but the impact that Paul doing it had on those around him. Because Paul, doing all of this, has now gone to a place called Malta. And I don't believe that place will ever be the same. Because they've gotten a taste of the God to whom I belong. When we look back at history, we see revivals breaking out. And a lot of times they break out on the heels of the darkest moments. Some of that is that God is strong in our weaknesses. And some of that is that people, when they have come to a storm where they have very little hope left, they get desperate and they come before God. And I read somewhere that where 2 or 3 are gathered together in His name, He's in their midst. I want to end with prayer. And this morning, maybe you're in a storm preparing for a wreck. Maybe you're on Malta. I don't know. But this morning, I want to be the church that is going to stand with you and come alongside of you and believe that we belong to a God who is capable and able. That we belong to a God who is not going to leave us. This morning, maybe you're not in a storm, but you still want to see God move. Maybe you're saying that when I hit that wall, when I hit that storm, I want to be prepared. I can tell you that the way you're prepared, the way you become like Paul, is by praying before you hit the storm. By being in a place where you say, God, I'm going to live for you, I'm going to serve you day in and day out. And whether the sun is shining or I'm in the middle of the worst storm of my life, I'm going to trust in you. Can I share a secret with you that even when you're not in a dire time, where 2 or 3 gather together in His name, He's in their midst. See, God wants to show up. He wants to move. He wants to go into your workplace and change the hearts of those watching. He wants to go into your home. He wants to go into your schools. I want us to be the church that prays together and for one another. I want us to be the church that prays for our homes. I want us to be a church that prays for our pastors, that prays for our city, that prays for our schools. This morning, as we prepare for the altars, would my prayer team please come? If this morning, if you're in a place where you say, I'm in a storm and I need someone to stand with me, we're going to have people down here that are going to stand with you and pray with you. And as I pray, as I close, if you say that's me, I want you to come and find one of the prayer team and let us stand with you. Maybe you're not in a storm, but you want to pray. We're going to open up the altars. I'm going to pray and dismiss. And if you find yourself in need, the altars are open and we want to stand with you. But church, this morning, I hope that we can go out and we can be a Paul in a place that needs a Paul. Because I want to be able to say that, you know what? There was a Paul on board. And because of that, there were some people that got saved. You may be in a storm, but you could still be a Paul. God, this morning, I thank you for the opportunities to be a Paul in the darkest of moments. God, I ask that you would give us the courage and the strength to go forward knowing and trusting that you are who you say you are. God, that I would live my life in the light to say that I love you and I'm going to trust in you in the bad times and the good times. God, I want to declare with the way I live to the God whom I belong. God, this morning I ask that if there are people going through a storm, that we would be the church that can stand with them. That we would be the Paul in that moment, in that situation, and come alongside them and see them through the storm. God, I ask that you would give us clarity in those moments. God, that we would have the wherewithal in that moment, God, to recognize that, man, this isn't fair, this is hard, it's going to hurt, but I have an opportunity to show your grace and your love to those around me. God, help us to live in the light that you've laid before us. God, we just give you all the praise and the glory this morning with the way we live and the way we act. In Jesus' name, amen. As you dismiss this morning, if you want to visit, I just ask that you do it out in the foyers. We don't disturb the altar times, but this morning, if you need to find a place at the altar, they're open.